Hello and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we do some shaking, we do some stirring, and we do some sipping of cocktails and other mixed drinks. Along the way we look at some variants, a little bit of history, and see how they taste. We're currently working through the IBA's list of classic cocktails and other drinks in the unforgettable section, and that brings us this week to the Angel Face. Now the Angel Face is a drink I am not very familiar with, so this will be a fun experience for me to try that. The Angel Face is a fairly simple drink, much like the others we've looked at so far. It is an equal parts drink. This one features gin, Calvados, and Apricot Brandy. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those ingredients further when we get to mixing. Now this drink has a history that's not entirely clear. The first guaranteed bona fide mention of it is in the 1930s Savoy cocktail book, which I'm sure we'll come back to more times throughout the series as it's a fairly influential one. There are thoughts that it goes back quite a bit further. Some people think as far back as the teens, maybe the 20s, and there are some tales that credit it to our old friend Harry Macalone, who was also credited with the invention of the Alexander in our 0th episode. This is unclear. Some say that he created it supposedly in celebration of the end of World War I. That might be true. One thing that the IBA puts forward is it would make sense if it originated in that slightly earlier time period because there was a disease that was blighting grapes in France at the time. Therefore, grape harvest would have been much lower, and so you would have looked to things like Calvados, which is of course an apple brandy, because grape brandies would have been less common or lower quality at the time. So that all makes sense. In terms of the name of the drink, the most common understanding is that it's named after a mobster who was active in northeastern US, sort of Pennsylvania, and also I think into Detroit and stuff. His name was Abe Kaminsky. He was from the Ukraine originally, and then spent most of his life in the U.S. doing gangster stuff, and he was known as Angel Face. So that's where it's most likely comes from. The only quibble I take with the IBA's history is they mention, just in passing at the very end, it's not likely that the other attribution, that to the protagonist of Casablanca, is true, because Casablanca came out 12 years after the drink was written. Or the drink was written down in the Savoy cocktail book, which I agree with them. It's not likely, but why even mention it, and why not give the rest of that story? They didn't explain who said it was attributed to him or why anyone thought that, because clearly it's 12 years later. That's just not it. But doesn't matter. Let's go ahead and make this drink according to the IBA specifications, and then let's look at how the IBA might not be making it the way they say they are, and talk a little bit about the technique here. So let's go ahead and mix this up. We're going to need a shaker, and we are going to need gin. We're using Ford's again. I know we used that in a recent episode, but we are going to be switching out our gin next episode. So we're sticking with Ford's for right now. And we're going to do equal parts. These are going to be 1 ounce or 3 centiliter, 30 milliliter pours again. We're seeing a lot of that in this era of cocktailing. Our 3 centiliters of gin. We're going to need 3 centiliters of Calvados, which, as I said, this is an apple brandy. Now, there are a few different things that are sometimes called apple brandies. This one is an actual brandy made entirely from apples, as opposed to some things that are brandies or neutral spirits flavored with apples. This is actually made with apples, and specifically Calvados is an AOC, a controlled appellation like Champagne or Parmesan, or, well, not Parmesan, but Parmigiano Reggiano. And that means that it has to be made in the Normandy region with certain types of apples and so on and so forth. So that is what we're using here. And then finally, Apricot Brandy. Now, like Calvados, Apricot Brandy can be either apricots actually made into brandy, in which case, really it's an apricot eau de vie, but Apricot Brandy, whatever. This is not that. That product is incredibly hard to find in the US, as well as some sources I've looked into suggest that that wouldn't have been what we had back in 1918 when this drink was made anyway. So this is Apricot du Roussillon, which is a Giffard product that is a mixture of some sort of neutral spirit and some sort of brandy or eau de vie or some other slightly flavorful spirit that then has apricots macerated in it for a long period of time. And that, I think, is what we want for this drink. Again, we're going to take a 30 milliliter or 1 ounce pour of that. And that is all of our ingredients. Let's get some ice. All right, we've got a big ice cube. We've got a couple smaller ice cubes. Let's shake it. All right, and then we're gonna strain that off into a preferably chilled coupe. And there we have it. This is the IBA spec Angel Face. Now before I drink it, what I'll draw your attention to is that there is a little bit of sort of bubbles going on up at the top of the drink. There's a little bit of foam, there's a little bit of cloudiness in the drink. This is not what it looks like on the IBA's website. More on that in a minute. Oh, that's really interesting. You definitely taste the apricots. You definitely get some of the gin botanicals, but they come a little bit later. It's really a fairly balanced drink. I lose the Calvados a little bit. I'd like more of that. But it's not, even though it's all spirit, it's not an incredible spirit punch. And these are all, fairly stiff spirits. So even though this is, apricot and this is apple, this is still 80 proof. And this is lower, but it's still 50 proof. It's not, it's not a really lightweight. So that is interesting. This is all spirit. Oh, you get apples off the nose. Yeah, apples off the nose, but the flavor profile, to me, I get the apricot more than I do the apple. It's really nice, though. I like that. That's a great drink. So I mentioned that the drink I just shook up looked quite a bit cloudier, bubblier, foamier than what's seen in the IBA. And this goes to sort of a question about this drink you might have thought of if you are a bit of a mixology person. Why is this drink shaken? We typically shake drinks if we want to aerate cream or if we need to integrate things that are hard to mix into drinks. So typically drinks with fruit juices in them are shaken, drinks with cream in them are shaken, things like that. But drinks that are all spirit, typically we would stir nowadays. Now, it is true that Harry Craddock's recipe in the Savoy cocktail book definitely says to shake the drink. However, there's a common thought out there I've heard from a number of places, and I tend to agree. You see most drinks of that time period and earlier shaken. And the general thought is that folks at the time would have known which ones really needed to be shaken and which ones really were just mixing. So the shaking was more of a pour it back and forth sort of thing than a real shake. It was really a sort of stir. It was more of, you'd kind of do this to the drink, shake it like that a little bit, and then it's done. So a really gentle, light shake, which would be closer to a stir. And so certainly modern methods to make this drink would make sense to stir it. Now, stirring it, though, does change something, which is that a stirred drink has lower dilution. So less water gets into the drink when you stir it than when you shake it. So first we're going to stir one up to IBA spec, and then we're going to look at a couple of options to sort of fix that dilution. And so let's go ahead and make that drink now. All right, for the stirred version, we have a mixing glass, which is a little bigger than I need for this. And I'm going to just throw in a couple of ice cubes into that. And then we're going to go ahead and build this exactly the same way. We're going to add 1 ounce or 30 milliliters of gin. we're going to add 1 ounce or 30 milliliters of Calvados. And we're going to add 1 ounce or 30 milliliters of the Apricot Brandy, or in this case, sort of apricot liqueur. One thing you might wonder hearing about Calvados and apple brandy is that the same thing as Applejack? What is Applejack? And the answer is, who knows? Applejack can be a number of different things. Traditionally, it's this thing where you freeze apple cider once it ferments, and then it's called jacking, which is an interesting name. And then that way the stuff that's not alcohol freezes, and the alcohol doesn't freeze, and you strain that off. That's not a recommended way to make anything because it's a little bit dangerous. And so nowadays, Applejack can either be like what Laird's makes, their normal Applejack is just neutral grain spirits vodka with some apple flavor in it. Or they make an apple brandy. They have 2 different versions of that. Those have a different flavor profile than Calvados because they use different kinds of apples and they're distilled in a different way. But those are true apple brandies. You could certainly make this with one of those. Laird's, their straight apple brandy, or their, had to check the name of that on my shelf, or their 7.5-year-old old apple brandy. You could definitely make it with that. It'll just be a little bit different flavor profile. I think slightly more whiskey-ish, slightly less apple-y, but delicious all the same. So we are going to go ahead and strain this off. This mixing glass is just slightly too big to be comfortable one-handed pour. But now we can see immediately this drink is crystal clear compared to the shaken one, which has been sitting here for 5 or 10 minutes now and still has bubbles in the top. This is clearly how they've made it on the IBA website. Yeah, I'm gonna say flavor entirely indistinguishable. This is purely a looks thing. If you want to get this crystal clear, you definitely stir it. Now, one thing I mentioned is the dilution is different. So some sources call for adding back a little bit of water to it, about 1/3 of an ounce of water to slightly tame it down, which I really don't think it needs. Though I did let it sit in there for a minute while I went on that digression about Laird's old apple brandy. So maybe I got that extra dilution anyway. One thing that was interesting though from Difford's guide was the idea of, if you're gonna add back liquid, make it taste like something. So they suggested adding apple juice. Actually, they said processed apple drink, which I don't really know what that means. So this is actually 100% apple juice. And they said to add 1/3 of an ounce of apple juice to it. So we're gonna try that. I don't think it needs it for dilution, but I'm curious what that does to the sweet balance of the drink, because apple juice does have some sweetness to it. So let's see if 1/3 of an ounce of apple juice does anything. Ever so slightly, it takes the edge of the tiny bit of spirit edge that's coming off of the gin. It slightly mellows it. I don't know if it's enhancing the apple taste. Maybe it is slightly fruitier. I don't dislike it. I don't think it's needed, but I think it definitely works. If you tried this drink and found it just a hair too harsh, a splash of apple juice, maybe even a hair more than that 1/3 of an ounce would be a nice touch. Last variant I want to share. I saw a couple sources, most notably the imbibed version, that cut back on both the gin and the apricot brandy in favor of leaving the Calvados at 1 ounce and then lowering the others to about 3/4 of an ounce. I'm not going to try that, but that would make sense to me because I mentioned the Calvados was getting lost. I'm also not going to try the suggestion I saw several places of swapping the apricot with creme de pêche or peach liqueur, because that to me changes the drink entirely. That's not a variant anymore. And some of the sources didn't even say it was a swap. They just said to use creme de pêche, which I'm not doing. So, what I did find interesting was in that imbibed version, they called for adding some lemon juice. So in there, they asked for half an ounce of lemon juice, which I found very fascinating. So we are going to try adding that to our first shaken drink. There we go. So this is half an ounce or 15 milliliters. We're just going to dump that right back in the shaker. Quick reshake. And let's pour our lemony version. So the ice was melted a little bit, so that watered it down a little more than I'm excited about. The lemon, though, totally changes that. I would say changes it enough that I'm not sure if this is a variant anymore. I think this is its own thing, because profile-wise, totally shifts. It's now apple. The lemon and apple have really partnered up to just shine through everything. So the apricot now is gone. Gin, there's a hair of. It's still a great drink. I would drink this, and I will make it again this way with the lemon, actually. But this is totally different. This is really not a variant anymore. This is a new drink. And it's delicious. Well, thank you for joining me this week as we looked at the Angel Face and a couple variants and a couple other options. Let me know if you try it, and if you try those different proportions or try it with the peach liqueur, what you think of it. As always, this will be on the blog as well, shakingandsipping.com, which will be linked in the description, where we'll have close-up photos and some more details on mixing it. That's also where you'll find when I go out into the world to a real cocktail bar and order this later this week to find out if they make it the same, different, if it's a common drink there, etc. You can also follow me on Twitter at shaking_sipping, which will be linked below as well. Same idea, just give you updates on when there's new blog posts and when there's new cocktail things happening. Love to have you there. Until next week, cheers.